Hi everyone, I'm Evelyn Waiwaioli, the Director of the Center for Community College Student Engagement, and welcome to the webinar on the latest report that we released last week entitled Expectations Meet Reality, the Underprepared Student and Community Colleges. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to join us. Again, I'm Evelyn, and we hope along the way that this can be as interactive as possible. I have been joined by several members of our center staff, and we would like to have your comments and also your questions along the way. So we hope you will be responsive to the questions along the way and even comments that you might have in the chat pod, and we'll be sure to respond to you during the webinar and get back to your questions as we are having this conversation. So a little bit about this report. Let me just give you an overview of its breadth and its scope. Many of you on this webinar have been longtime members of the center, whether you've participated or your college has participated in CCCSE, our hallmark instrument, or SENSE, the instrument that is administered in the fall semester. And we want to say thank you. No buts. I just want to say thank you for participating. But what I do hope to tell you is that it's through your participation that we are able to pull together this report and have a national picture about what the typical community college students' experience is when it comes to what are their perceptions when they come to our colleges, what are their thoughts on assessment and placement, and then what's happening in the world of developmental education. For all of you that are joining us today, you know that there is a lot of buzz in the world of developmental education today. And so that's why we wrote this report, just so that you can have an overview again about how many students are represented in this report. Over 70,000 community college student respondents are featured in this report from 150 institutions. And then we have 4,500 community college faculty respondents from 56 institutions. So again, I recently had somebody actually at the Achieving the Dream conference last week. I had somebody at the Achieving the Dream conference last week ask me something about the data, and I jokingly said, I'm not sure we really want to talk about the data unless you really want to, because I said we're really talking about 70,000 students. So, we really have an amazing breadth and scope of the student perspective. So, and again, none of that would be possible without you. So thank you. So let's dive in a little bit and talk about this report. And along the way, like I said earlier, I'll be asking some questions of all of you because we also want to hear about what you're doing on your college campuses. For my own organization of this report, I've really divided it into 3 buckets, and that's kind of how we've laid it out. But the first one is the bucket of what are students' perceptions when they show up in the parking lot about what it means to go to community college. And I say the parking lot because we actually haven't walked into the building yet. But what are their perceptions, and then what's reality? So let's dive into this a little bit. Students' perceptions are that they believe they are academically prepared. In fact, 86% of students reported that they feel prepared to succeed at this college. I'm going to stop there for a second. What would that data point look like on your college campus? This is where you might want to just type some things into the participant chat. What would this look like on your college campus? Would it be higher? Would it be lower? Okay, we've got a few folks that are typing in, and we'll come back and look at their responses. Some folks are saying lower. Some are saying, they think about the same maybe. Well, what's interesting is that 68% of students take developmental education. We're checking the audio. Thank you for some of the feedback that we're getting that it's not working properly. I hope this is better. So what's interesting is 68% of our students end up taking one developmental education course. And what's so interesting about that is that they came thinking that they were academically prepared. So let's expand on that a little bit. So what does that look like if we dive a little deeper into the data? So we wanted to have an understanding about, okay, we have all of these students placing into Dev Ed. What was their high school experience like? We wanted to, and now let me just say, we realize everyone placing into Dev Ed is not coming straight from high school. In fact, the typical or the average age of a community college student is 29. But we wanted to understand from those coming straight out of high school, what would they say was their high school GPA, and then kind of analyze this data from that perspective. And what we found out students still placing into a developmental education course. And again, I'll just pause for a second. What would this data look like on your college campus? So I'm trying to speak louder. I know we're having some volume issues. If it continues to persist, please let us know, and we're working on that. The other thing we wanted to do was dive in a little bit deeper and understand, how quickly, again, this gets back to our students are still sitting in the parking lot. They haven't actually entered the building yet. But what are their perceptions about how quickly they will achieve their goals? What we found out by looking at the data was that 61% of students believed that it would take them 2 years or less to accomplish their goals. Now, when you look at national data, what you quickly realize is that only 39% of students will earn a degree or certificate within 6 years. So again, what we saw in this very first bucket is there's a great deal of disconnect between what students' perceptions are and what reality is. And I'd just be curious, from those that are joining us today, how many of you are academic advisors? You can actually go up to the little gentleman up at the very top. He has his hand, or it could be a woman. This little icon has their hand up. We have one person that's raising their hand, 2 people, lots of people raising their hands. I bring this up because you're the ones that are dealing with these misperceptions. They're coming. They have these thoughts, then they land in a chair in your cubby or in your office, and you're the one that's having to navigate these thoughts. Not always easy to do, but a very, very important role. So thanks for sharing. It looks like we have a couple folks on here that are from academic advising. So that's the first bucket. Again, students in the parking lot, what are their perceptions, what's reality, and again, just how very important it is for advisors to have an understanding of what our students' perceptions are. I want to go to the second bucket. Lot. They've actually made their way onto the college, into the college building, and now they're trying to understand, where do I go next? Where do I fit? And we wanted to understand, as many of you know, there is a great deal of conversation going on about assessment and placement. And we wanted to understand, what is the typical community college student's experience when it comes to assessment and placement? I bring up that there's a great deal of buzz going on in our sector about assessment and placement. Many of you know that there's been some conversation or noise about the validity of these placement tests. Some states have actually created their own placement test. There are other colleges or systems that are considering other options or using multiple measures for how to identify and place students appropriately. So again, we wanted to understand, what's the typical experience with all of this noise and all of this innovation and all of this experimentation. And what we saw in the data is that even with all of this innovation and experimentation, 87% of students are required to take a placement test still today, even with all of this innovation and experimentation. Again, let me just pause here for a second. What does this look like on your college campus? Are you guys doing something different? Are placement tests required? Give us a little bit of feedback from our 53 participants. What's happening on your college campus when it comes to assessment and placement? Lori Ann's telling us they use multiple measures. We have placement tests are required, but our system is exploring using multiple measures. AccuPlacer, placement scores. If too low on ACT, asset, or compass is required. So lots of experimentation and innovation going on. Thanks for sharing. So let's dive a little bit deeper into assessment and placement and see what else we learned. We wanted to have an understanding about, students' grades in high school and then placement test. And this is what we found in the data. While I was in high school, besides taking the SAT or ACT, I completed the college's placement test to assess my academic skills in reading, writing, and/or math. So what we saw was that students responding, 41% of them said yes to this if they had a B or higher. And then 44% said no, and again, those are our B or higher students. Again, what's happening at your college campus? Do you even know this data point? We also wanted to drill down even a little bit deeper and wanted to understand students with lower grade, what was going on with students with lower grades, and are they more likely to be required to take placement test? And I don't think this is a big aha moment here. I think we could all say yes, students with lower grades are more likely to be required to take placement test. But if you look at our next slide, we also wanted to understand what was going on with our students preparing for the placement tests. And if so, do they find that they're valuable? We wanted to have an understanding of what was going on with, did they receive enough advance notice? And what we realized is that students, 66% of students received more than a month notice before taking the test. Again, what's happening on your campus when it comes to notifying students about the placement test? How do you notify them? What if you're getting really close to registration? Do they have that month's notice? What's happening there? Does it vary if the student is straight out of high school versus they're an older student that's returning? How are you handling notifying them about the placement test? I don't think many students realize that this really does have some high stakes. So how do we notify them? We also wanted to understand about preparation. So we looked at, were students preparing using resources provided by the college? And what we saw was that 41% of students were preparing. So that was encouraging news, I think, for us. But what we realized is, what would happen if all of those students, even the other 59%, were doing something to prepare for the placement test? We have a couple examples in our report about colleges that are doing something when it comes to preparation, and one of them is Passaic County Community College. Anybody here on the webinar from Passaic? No? Okay. Well, you can definitely look this profile, if you will, or kind of overview of what Passaic is doing up in our report. But what they did is they created a tool. Overall, students who use the tool, I'm sorry, let me back up a second. They created an online placement tool, and they really said no more cold testing. We want students to be prepared, to be able to take the placement test, realize its implications, and understand that if you take some time to prepare, that you're going to see some different outcomes. And that's what they began to see. So overall, students who used the tool were less likely to place into the lowest level of developmental English and math than those who did not use the tool. And then placement into the lowest level of developmental English and math decreased slightly among students who used the tool. I'd be curious, from those of you that are joining us today, how many of your institutions have some type of online placement test? I'm sorry, not online placement test, but online kind of resource or tool so that students can be able to log in and be able to access this resource prior to taking the placement test. Well, if you are in a position at your institution where you might be able to do something about this, you might want to reach out to Passaic County Community College, because I do know that they have shared this resource with other colleges across New Jersey. I don't think we need to be in the business of reinventing something that's already having some significant outcomes. And you could definitely reach out to them and see if they might be willing to share this resource with you. In fact, I'm certain that they would be. Another example that we feature in the report is Washington State Community College in Ohio, not to be confused with in Washington. Just curious, anybody on the webinar that's from this institution? So they did something very similar to what Passaic did, and they wanted to be sure that students had the opportunity to be in some type of refresher or brush up. And so they had a mandatory brush up that helped students improve for the placement test. And this is what they saw after taking the brush up workshop. 27% of students who originally placed into developmental math increased placement by 1 level. Now, if we could be honest with ourselves, that's significant. We need all the help we can get here. 5% tested out of developmental math altogether. And then when you look at English, 56% of students who originally placed into developmental English increased placement by 1 level. And then take a look at this last data point. 33% placed directly into freshman composition. Again, not insignificant under any terms. And I would just be curious, I know some of you were already talking about, what you're perhaps you could just share a little bit about that with us. I want to give you one other example. Anybody from North Carolina joining us? I broadened it to more than just an institution, just from the whole state of North Carolina. We've got a few. Well, in this one, we're featuring the work of Davidson County Community College, obviously in North Carolina. And, up until now, we've been talking about refresher or, getting students the opportunity to brush up on some skills that perhaps they just haven't seen in quite some time, if we were going to be honest. Well, Davidson County Community College is doing something very different. They are actually using, for students that come out of high school and have met specific criteria, they are using the implementation of multiple measures for placement. And what you can see right here is Success in English Gatekeeper placed based on high school transcript data. Look right there and you can begin to see the outcomes that they're having by using this alternative approach for placement. I won't read all of those data points to you, but you can see them. I do think it's important to realize that this is serving a subset of our entering students. Again, when our average age at a community college is 29, this is serving students that are coming out of high school. They're also having to have met a specific criteria in order to even be considered for use of multiple measures. But when it is used, you can see some real positive outcomes. And I know earlier when I asked if any of you were using multiple measures, many of you responded with yes. Again, just curious, what does your data look like? You may not have it on hand, but are you seeing similar types of outcome data when you're using this approach to placement? I want to take you from this example on Davidson County Community College and take you to some of the qualitative work here at the center and really just listen in to what a student has to say about how they thought they might get placed at a community college. And I think it brings back home to all of us why it's so important to have many approaches, that there's not a silver bullet in this work, that it is very complex. But let's listen in to this student as she shares about her own experience in being placed. Let me get us the video.
I've always been good in every subject I ever taken, so it was like a shock to me that I was like right on the borderline, but at the same time a disappointment because I wasn't expecting to fail to my standards.
Hitting it. There we go. Everybody, I'm hoping you can hear me now because here comes the sound again. Nothing like bringing in a video and then you lose sound. We want to make sure that everybody's a part of the conversation. It's back! Great, we're in business now. So what I want to talk a little bit about is that students with better grades are more likely to prepare for placement tests. Again, I think all of you that are on your college campuses, this data point wouldn't be such an aha moment, but hopefully when you pair it with the next data point, you see again where we have some disconnect because almost all students who use the college provided test preparation materials, out of them, 96% said that they were helpful. So then it gets back to why aren't more using it? And I go back to that role of advisors and what resources do we have on our college campuses to make sure that students are successful and they realize the importance and the value of these tests. So you can see right there, we just have a little bit of some disconnect about it's helpful. We know students with higher grades are actually preparing, but it's the one with the lower grades that we need to begin to prepare, and we have to communicate that message about placement and how important it is for them to do well so that they can begin taking college level credits right away. And when we look at this, we also wanted to understand students' perceptions of their placement. It goes back to that student voice that we just listened to. She was talking about what she expected, and clearly she didn't expect what happened to her. So we wanted to understand students' perceptions of their placement. For example, when they enrolled in the English course indicated by their placement test, what did they think about that course? And it was very, very interesting to us that 70% of the students thought that it was appropriate for their skill level at this time. And then if you look at the math, 63% of students thought it was appropriate for their skill level. I do want to just stop here. One, do you ask your students this question? Have you ever come back to them and asked them this question? And I didn't ask this earlier, but by a show of hands with our little guy up at the top, the icon, how many of you teach developmental education that are listening in today? We've got quite a few hands going up. I'd be curious to some of your responses. Do your students think that they've been placed appropriately? Obviously, we're going to have some that have that disconnect, but once they've settled in, what kind of feedback do you get from those students? I'm trying to move this. I can't. There we go. Can you move to the next slide? So we'll just take a few minutes and just want to hear a little bit about assessment and placement on your own institution. What kind of results are you having? What is your college doing? We've got some folks already talking about high school and folks not getting the basics in high school. We have an example in our report from Lee College here in Texas where they are reaching down into the high schools and beginning to build those bridges. I'm sure many of your institutions are working closely with the high schools. This is not something new. What else is happening on your institution, at your institution? We have one comment about once folks settle in, they do feel placement is appropriate. We have lots of folks typing, anxious to hear about what's happening on your campus. Okay, so let's go kind of to our third bucket. And this is really going to be looking at faculty members and effective placement. I want to talk a little bit about what we learned when we looked at our CCCSE data. I know many of your institutions do CCCSE. If you don't, this is an instrument we have here at the center that is a companion to CCCSE, and we're really looking at faculty's thoughts on student engagement. And this is what we found when we looked at the data. More than half of faculty use early assessments. And how many faculty are joining us today? I know I asked about developmental education faculty, but how many faculty in general? Oh, quite a few. So this isn't surprising to you. At the beginning of the current term, did you administer an in-class assessment to determine your students' preparedness or level of preparedness to succeed in the course? This is not new to you. But then we wanted to understand, how does this break out when you look at developmental education faculty versus faculty teaching only college level courses? And what we saw is that faculty teaching developmental courses, they were more likely to early on assess. In fact, 70%, where faculty teaching only college level courses were at 54%. Curious, is that surprising to you, or is that what you expected? Got quite a few people typing. I'm anxious to see what you, this is what some folks are saying is expected. Okay, so then developmental education, 70% of them are doing some type of early assessment, and we do mean early. So then what happens? And I'm really anxious to hear a little bit from the developmental education faculty that are joining us today when we look at the next slide. This is what we found out, that faculty who say they do the early assessment, then what's the next action based off of the results of this assessment? What was interesting to us is that most faculty recommend to a student that he or she use tutoring or other academic support. Secondly, what was really interesting to us was that they adjust their course pedagogy or approach. Tremendous amount of work to do that. So for all of you faculty that are doing that, we salute you. But what was really puzzling to us is that very rarely is a student advised to drop the course. We'd like a little feedback on that. Is it because there's not a mechanism in place to help a student do that? Does the assessment come too late in the semester? What's happening there? Why is that not a more viable option? Of course, there's sensitivities to a student, but the student could also be placed into a higher level class. It's not always necessarily lower. What's happening there? We have lots of folks responding, and I'm anxious to see those responses. So now we'll go into our final bucket, and it really is looking at these new approaches that are happening across the country when it comes to developmental education. And for some of you, you may say this isn't quite so new. We've been doing it for quite some time. But it is this notion of co-requisite, where colleges are trying to improve developmental education and they are pairing two classes together. You can look at it when in the stem over here when we say, well, at this college I have enrolled in a college level English course and a developmental English course during the same academic terms. So this co-requisite model or notion, and many of you are very familiar with this work underneath the leadership of Peter Adams at the Community College of Baltimore County. Well, what we found, and this wasn't surprising to us in our data, is that when students participate in a co-requisite model, they are more engaged. And by engaged, that's a proxy for student success. If you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see the 5 CCCSE benchmarks. And across the board, students are more engaged when they participate in a co-requisite English. So that's a good thing, right? Then look at the circle. Look at the pie chart. What you quickly realize is only 40% of students are having this or experiencing this opportunity. Now, on the upside of this, I want to say, I'm not even sure we could have said that 5 years ago, 3 years ago. So you're seeing a lot of movement around this model. But this is something that we know works. CCRC has done some, Community College Research Study Center has done some work in this area. We're now putting this out. We know this model works. And so the question I would leave us with as we continue to wrap up this webinar, but is what's happening to those other 60%? If we know something works, why aren't we having students participate in it? Just curious from those that are joining us now, how many of you at your institution have some type of co-rec English as it's defined here? So let's go on to the next slide, and you see that same type of analysis when it comes to co-requisite math. And again, similar definition. I have enrolled in a college level math course and a developmental math course during the same academic term. And you see when you look at the right-hand side of this slide, across the board, students are more engaged, more likely to be successful. And I know we have Karen Klippel on here, and she's from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and they're doing a lot of good work in the area of how do we consider different math alternatives. And so when you know that we have a model that is working, I think you have to again ask yourself that same question. We have 31% of our students participating in this model that we know is effective and knows works, but what's happening to this other 69%? What's happening there? One more slide on this. And I'm just giving you an example. Most people know of the good work that has happened at Community College of Baltimore County. I already mentioned that institution, but in our report, we featured the work that's happening at Butler Community College in Kansas. Anybody joining us today for the webinar that's from Butler? Well, this is a very similar model to what Community College of Baltimore County did, in that they're pairing the highest level of developmental education with the gateway course. But then something else that's unique to what they did is they actually then took the other 2 developmental education courses and paired those. And that's part of why we featured them, is because we wanted to show there's many ways to do this, and they made it work for what their needs were at their own institution. And you can see right here, get a glance at the data that they're seeing. Again, they don't have a tremendous amount of longitudinal data because it's something that's new on their campus, but you can begin to see that they're seeing some really positive outcomes because of this pairing of these 2 courses. Anybody else doing something innovative when it comes to co-recs? As I mentioned earlier, this is just one example of what colleges are doing when it comes to helping students be more successful once they have actually placed into developmental education. But there are many, many other examples. Again, the example in our report was from Lee College. We talk about redesigning the math pathway. So there's many, many other alternatives to what's happening. We just chose to feature this one for the purposes of this webinar. Again, I think it's important to hear the student voice. I know many of you that are teaching hear these voices all the time, but for some of us, perhaps you're in administration and you don't have that opportunity to hear about students' perspectives on something. So we wanted to give you an opportunity to hear from several students as they talk about co-rec.
Instead of it being one class and another accompany class that'll help you with that, it was actually two separate classes. It was beginner intro to college level mathematics and then actual college level mathematics, but he partnered it up so that we would learn in one class, learn it again in another class, and then apply it and apply it, learn it, apply it. So we would have double the information of what we would learn in one class to apply it for.
We have one more video we want to show you, and this is about a student talking a little bit about some apprehensions she had about taking a co-rec and then how she felt after she took it. Let's listen in.
It's like having your teacher be your tutorer, you know, after you've learned something in the class. Now she's tutoring you in 052. But I also like the fact that it made me welcome 102, English 102. It made me welcome that. I was like, I can do this, because I didn't think I could do it at first with the 101. And so, like I said, I thought it was going to be really difficult, but then it turned out not to be. But what it did for me was it boosted my confidence in myself and my ability to do this. You know, I was like, oh, so is that all I have to do? You know, I was waiting for it to be difficult, you know. And so I've actually already done my 102, and I did very well in it. So it encouraged me.
Many of you can really relate to the student that was just talking. Perhaps they've been your own student. But I think what's so powerful there is you hear this student who has a little bit of caution, but then realizes the amazing opportunity that she had. And again, I just leave you with that question. If we know it works, we're hearing students talk about it, and we know in the data that they're more engaged, then why aren't all students participating in this? Just leave you with one other data point when it comes to models that are being implemented across the country, and that's computer-based developmental math. You know, I didn't think anyone here at the center knew how this data point would come out, and perhaps this might be a little bit shocking to all of you as well. But what we thought was interesting is that as we asked about, well, we wanted to find out if students participated in a computer-assisted developmental math, were they more engaged, similarly to what was happening with math co-rec and English co-rec. And again, you see across the board that from all 5 of the CCCSE benchmarks, if they participated in a computer-based developmental math, the students are more engaged. So again, what's happening here? How many students are having this opportunity? And we see that about 44% of students are having this opportunity, and there's lots of good models out there of this working. Perhaps your institution does something similar here. But again, if something's working, is it in the tool belt so that students can be able to have that opportunity? Is it one of the services your institution provides so that we can shrink that 56% of students who are not participating in this opportunity? So let's just hear a little bit from you. You know, we've talked about some of these innovations that are happening in the actual classroom. What's happening at your institution, whether it be co-rec or computer-based developmental math? What's happening at your institution or at your system? We have a lot of folks responding. And then in the spirit of being considerate of your time, just want to leave you with a little bit of what we have at the end of this report. And it's questions for consideration. You know, I said when we started this conversation or this webinar, this report was really intended to be kind of an understanding of what's the state of students' perceptions, assessment and placement, and developmental education across the country right now. And I say that in the spirit of, with all of the innovation, with all of the experimentation, with everything that's happening, we wanted to truly understand what is the typical community college student's experience. And I'm sure for all of you joining in today, that your institution is doing something innovative and seeing whether it's working and trying to understand the success rate of it. But no matter where you are, we wanted to make sure we left you in this report with some questions for consideration. Perhaps you're in the pilot stage and you're beginning to think about scaling up. Or perhaps you're in the design stage and you're trying to determine, do I design for a pilot or do I design for scale? So we wanted to leave you with some questions for consideration that might be a resource for you on at your institution. These are in the back of the report, but they're also available on our website, CCCSE.org. They're intended to just be something you can print off and take to a meeting so that you can begin to explore, you know, where are we with accelerated developmental education? Are we offering co-rec? What's the role of faculty members in the assessment and placement process? What's the role of advisors? What's the role of faculty as advisors in this process? So we intended to give you some questions for thought as you begin to grapple with all of this at your own institution, and especially as you begin to fine-tune and revise some of the policies and practices you have in place. This is actually the end of our formal presentation, but I want to leave an opportunity for you to ask questions. Of course, you can ask questions of us after this webinar at info@CCCSE.org or by phone 512-471-6807. And of course, this will be saved and archived on our homepage, so you'll be able to share it with colleagues that perhaps weren't able to participate in the live webinar. But we'll take about the next 3 minutes. If you have any questions right now that you would like one of our staff to respond to, we'd be happy to do that. We have a lot of folks asking about the co-rec courses. Is it best for the students to be in a cohort and have the same instructor for both classes? If some of you are doing that, if you wouldn't mind sharing what you're doing at your institution. We've got a question that I think deserves serious consideration, and to Beth Bentley, I really do want to thank you for asking it. And she says, do you have models for cost-effective advising for developmental education students? That is not something we addressed in this report, but it is definitely something that needs conversation. And I would just be curious from those that are joining in, what's happening with advising on your campus as you work through what are going to be the solutions to improve developmental education success rates, because it definitely has to be a part of the conversation. Lots of conversation about advising, and there's lots of good work happening in this area alongside the work of developmental education. And I think the two definitely have to be handled together and coupled together, because this, again, as we said earlier on, there is no silver bullet to this very complex issue. Well, everyone, in the spirit of being sensitive to your time, our time together has come to an end. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us after this webinar if you have questions or comments or thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. To all the faculty that are joining us today that have and to all of you colleges that have participated in CCCSE, SENSE, and CCCSE, we also thank you. This report would not be possible without your participation. Please stay in good touch, and we look forward to hearing from all of you soon. Thanks so much.